Welcome to the 5 a.m. podcast, where we bring you insightful conversations with thought leaders and influencers who are making headway and maybe some waves in their industries and callings. And today we are thrilled to have with us Jonathan Newman. Jonathan is a distinguished Henry Hazlitt Fellow at the Mises Institute, where he contributes significantly to advancing Austrian economic theory and its practical implication in contemporary markets. With his expertise in Austrian business cycle theory and monetary policy, Newman has established himself as a thought leader, bringing classical Austrian economic principles to modern economic challenges. His work on price theory and market processes continues the intellectual tradition established by leaders like Ludwig von Mises and Henry Hazlitt, making him an invaluable voice in today's economic discourse. Now, before we roll that intro, please share this with your friends and networks. I know many are going to enjoy this conversation. Now, there's two other things that if you could be so kind, I will prevail upon you to give us a 5-star review on your favorite podcast player. We would appreciate that. And we also need to thank those who ventured over to buymeacoffee.com/5am podcast and bought us those cups of coffee this week and last. We appreciate your support. And hey, if you want to join those early risers who have bought in to support the mission of 5am podcast, we welcome you to join us in our mission to help others seize the day. Now, let's roll that intro. Jonathan Newman, welcome to the 5am podcast.
Hi, I'm glad to be with you. Thanks for having me.
Oh, yeah. Anytime I get to talk about people like Henry Hazlitt and others, it's a delightful day. It's just a refreshing way, I think, to look at economics. Now, I got to start with this quote from Henry Hazlitt. He said, "The only way government bureaucrats know how to keep prosperity going is to inflate some more, to increase the deficit, or to pump more money into the system." I think that's very appropriate for today. What are your thoughts on that statement?
Yeah, it's clearly the dominant view in the politician class and the bureaucrat class, really the broader technocratic class that's in Washington, D.C. They really only know of one way to get an economy going, or to try to get out of a depression or help the economy grow. And unfortunately, it's the wrong answer. So they think that they can stimulate economic activity with money printing and with government spending. But of course, in the Austrian tradition, in Austrian economics, we understand that money printing and government spending, it's wasteful. It causes all sorts of distortions in the broader economy. And what we need for economic growth is simply entrepreneurship and production. We need to make sure that prices are doing their work, and that entrepreneurs can use market prices to calculate profit and loss. And it's really through that profit and loss mechanism that we get entrepreneurs truly serving consumers' interests. Entrepreneurs truly, producing the things that consumers want. So so Hazlitt's view, as well as the rest of the Austrian tradition, it's very skeptical of government involvement, of increases in the size and scope of government, and especially of money printing.
Yeah. So can you give us maybe the Coles notes, or just a snapshot on how the Austrian economic theory came to be, and maybe what was its contemporaries at the time of its origin?
Well, it's a lively and active school of thought today, but it owes its origin to Karl Menger, who was writing in the late 1800s in Austria. That's why it's called the Austrian School of Economics. And of course, some of the other early Austrian economists were following in Menger's footsteps. People like Eugen von Bombawerk, Ludwig von Mises, F.A. Hayek. And what Karl Menger did is he presented a totally new way of looking at the economy, looking at markets, that was different from what other economists were doing at the time. So in particular, he went up against the what was called the German historical school. The German historical school, they were apologists for the state. They were always trying to come up with defenses of government involvement in the economy, government intervention. And their method in particular was using statistics. So they would look at the raw data and try to come up with economic uh, conclusions based on that data. You can't really say that they were coming up
Yeah.
with economic theory, because they were really just looking at statistical correlations at the time. But what
Yeah.
Carl Menger did was he showed that we can take a causal realist view. We can think about action as such. We can think about the choices that people make. And when people make choices, they're not doing math in their head. They're not on some
Mhm.
sort of predetermined course, but what they're doing is they're choosing to do various things according to the ends that they have. So to take a simple example, if you think about going to the grocery store and deciding to purchase a particular item, what you're doing when you decide to purchase something, put it in the cart and take it to the cash register. What you're doing is you're saying, I prefer to have that good over the money. I
Mhm.
would rather have that good in my possession so that I can consume it at home, as opposed to continuing to hold on to the money. So if you
Yeah.
think about that thought process, that what's going on inside the consumer's mind, it's merely an expression of value. I prefer this over that,
Mhm.
and we can't really assign numbers. We can't assign any sort of constant relations in terms of the way that people are thinking and acting.
Yeah.
People change. The options that are open to them change. Their values are constantly changing.
Mhm.
Production decisions are always changing as well, which means that the way that Austrian economics, from the start, starting with Carl Menger, the way that we view the economy is this very dynamic uh, process in which
Yeah.
producers and consumers are making their decisions based on their values and based on their expectations, and it's
Right.
not something that can be modeled mathematically, and it's
Mhm.
certainly not something that we can elucidate just by looking at statistics like the
Of
German
course.
historical school
And
was.
I will say, looking at statistics to try and build out a path forward sounds very German, if you
Yeah.
ask me. Sounds very German. We don't have to innovate. Let's just see what's happened based on statistics. And of course, Mark Twain, I don't know, we don't want to say he was a fan of statistics, but he had a famous quote about what statistics actually are. So, I thinking back to then the origins of this time period, what what were the economic realities of Austria and Germany at the time?
Broadly speaking, socialism was on the rise. So there was this sort of new way of thinking about society and the economy that was based on class conflict and exploitation. And so a lot of the early Austrian economists were writing uh, against those sorts of
Yeah.
views and explaining how they're incorrect. But also, as I said, Menger especially was sort of doing intellectual battle with the German historical school, and he was really making a claim that there's this better way of doing economics. There's a better method of
Mhm.
discovering economic laws,
Yeah.
such that we actually can describe the way that markets work. We can talk about demand, we can talk about supply, production, entrepreneurship, using this logical deductive method, as opposed to just collecting facts, collecting data, and then trying to see what the data say to us.
Uh-huh.
So those sorts of things were going on at the time, both intellectually and in terms of like political views and economic views, and that was really sort of the crucible.
Yeah.
That's what was going on when Austrian economics was born. If I may just continue
Sure.
through the 20th century, uh, of course, the intellectual battle with socialism continued, because socialism has this very attractive way of looking at things. If something goes wrong in your life, they have a scapegoat. You can
Right.
blame the greedy capitalists. But another major turn in economics happened with the Keynesian revolution. So John Maynard Keynes
Yes.
started writing about how we can use government deficits and lots of government spending to try to rescue economies. So throughout the 20th century, a lot of the Austrian critiques were pointed at that view, the Keynesian view.
Yeah.
So even though they were critiquing socialism, critiquing the German historical school, critiquing Keynesianism, Austrian economics is not just a bundle of critiques. We
Yeah.
we don't exist just as a negation of or refutation of all the other schools of thought. The
Right.
Austrian School of Economics is its own school of thought that offers a positive way of looking at the economy and explaining the way things work.
Mhm. And I was thinking of I guess one of the contemporaries probably at the time would have been that fellow Karl Marx.
That's right. Yeah.
And Henry Hazlitt, he has a quote. I'm just going to read it off the screen here. The whole gospel of Karl Marx can be summed up in a single sentence: hate the man who's better off than you are.
Yep. Yep.
Yes. And so I know we could go on and on. I know that I like quotes. I've got to come up with I don't know, sayings of success, some sort of book on quotes that we can just flip through and see all these witty phrases. But um, Carl Menger said, "Man himself is the beginning and the end of every economy." And I don't want to have any dead air, but let's talk about even that idea of it was actually looking at individualism, perhaps coming out of. Would you agree? Maybe coming out of the, let's say, fiefdom mindset.
Yes. So, in that quote, what Carl Menger is saying is that when we think about what the economy is, the
Uh-huh.
economy is a network of individuals who are exchanging with one another, they're making their own choices based on their values.
Yeah.
And so, if we want to think about anything that's going on inside of markets or the economy broadly, the way that we have to explain is we have to go back to the individual. We have to
Mm-hmm.
consider consumer wants, consumer expectations. We have to think about what producers know and why they're making the decisions that they do. And just to give an example,
Mm-hmm.
one way that uh, the Austrian school brings everything back to the individual is thinking about things from the entrepreneur's perspective. So if you
Yes.
think about production decisions that have to be made, you have to decide who to hire, you have to decide what to produce and what quantities.
Yep.
Once you finally produce that good, you might have this ability to decide on what prices to announce and sell your product. And one of
Yes.
the great conclusions of the Austrian school is that all of those decisions in a capitalistic free market sort of economy, they're all directed at satisfying consumer demands. So
Right.
just to take a very particular example, when an entrepreneur is deciding to purchase a particular factor of production, what they're doing is they're thinking about how much am I willing to pay for this thing? How much am I willing to pay for this capital good? How much am I willing to pay for this plot of land? How
Mm-hmm.
much am I willing to pay this potential employee? And the way that they make that decision is they think about what is the impact on my bottom line?
Yeah.
How is that going to change how much revenue that I bring in? And which means that they're thinking about how much consumers will pay for the product at the end of the production process. So
Yeah.
every little decision that's made by entrepreneurs is based on satisfying future consumer demands, which is a
That's
totally different way of looking at entrepreneurial decision making
yeah.
compared, especially to the Marxist view. So in the
Mm-hmm.
Marxist view, it's all about exploitation. It's how much can I squeeze out of my workers, um, and there's really no view to the broader implications of the
Yes.
fact that entrepreneurs are making things to satisfy consumers.
That's right. And just to back up your point, uh, when so one of the reasons that Karl Marx was angry at capitalists is he said and felt that they were not driving their workers hard enough to get more effort out of them. That's correct, isn't it?
You're saying that that's what Marx said?
That's correct. That was my understanding of looking like so I think the city in Russia is called Rostov on the Don. And that's where they had the first workers revolt. But from what I was reading, Karl Marx was pursuing the socialist idea because he felt workers were not actually worked hard enough and they were not productive as they could be. Like we need to squeeze more juice out of those grapes.
Well, if you think about it, that's the view of the uh, central planners
Mm-hmm.
incentives or the central planners way of looking at things.
Yeah.
So if you are proposing that we need central planning of the economy as opposed to letting people go through their voluntary exchanges and decide to buy and sell things on their own,
Yeah.
if you have this view of central planning, it means that the state is in charge of all production decisions. And so what you have to do is you have to try to figure out how to squeeze all of that output, all of that productivity out of your workers, as
Yeah.
opposed to the typical market interaction between employers and employees, where they come to a mutually beneficial arrangement where the employer has to offer a total compensation, which doesn't just include wages, but it includes, working conditions, working time, all sorts of things about the culture of the company that you're working for. And so then potential workers, they look at this package really, and they decide, yes, that is worth it to me. I will, offer my labor services for this company so that I can work in this environment and earn this wage. And then the employer also benefits as well by being able to employ those people to make something that consumers want. So
Right.
it's a very different way of looking at worker motivation and uh, entrepreneurial motivation. So in the central planner's view, we need to make all of these top down decisions to squeeze out as much productivity as we can. But in the market view, what happens is we have all of these mutually beneficial exchanges where people have to offer something that other people want in exchange for
Right.
the thing that they would get.
Yeah. And thinking to our friends in government, will say, I think it was Ludwig von Mises, it might have been Henry Hazlitt, who talked about how government has to fail because they constantly have to have new bureaucracy. Would you
Yes.
agree with? Am I kind of over the target with that one?
Well, no, I think that's right. So what Mises is thinking about is in government, you don't have that profit and loss test. In the
Mm-hmm.
market, you do have that profit and loss test. And so businesses live or die based on whether or not they're efficiently using resources to satisfy consumer demands. But if you think
Yeah.
about what the government does, there's no real tests like that. That their revenues are collected coercively, so through taxation, uh, and and there's no real connection between how much we pay in taxes and how much we value services that are provided by the government. And in fact,
Right.
many of the services provided by the government they're not services at all. They're really more depredations upon our rights or the things that we would like to do.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's what Mises is thinking about. He's saying if the government is doing something, it lacks this essential test that's present in the market, which means that we can't expect profitability. We can't expect the government to be run like a business simply because the fundamentals are categorically different.
Yeah. Yes, I just found that quote. The what I was thinking of is from Henry Hazlitt's "A Torrent of Laws," where it talks about how government needs to be that failure to perpetuate itself, like I had mentioned. So, do you see evidence in that perhaps Elon Musk, with his Doge department, and President Trump have been maybe reading some works of Henry Hazlitt or some other Austrian economic thinker?
I'm not sure. I do know that Musk is very fond of Milton Friedman, who's
Okay.
another real
Yeah.
champion of free markets. He's definitely not an Austrian economist, but of course, there's some overlap in terms of
Mhm.
the policy prescriptions, in terms of laissez-faire, small government, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Uh, so I don't know if they're reading Mises and Hazlitt and Bastiat and those guys.
That would be
It would
nice
be
if they
very
did.
nice.
Yeah, sure would
But
be.
I'm definitely a fan of Doge. I think we've needed this sort of thing, this sort of shakeup for a
Hmm.
long time.
Yeah.
What we've had over decades is, just the status quo where we have this government that's increasing in size and
Mhm.
scope and spending on all sorts of things that are not prescribed by the Constitution,
Yeah.
even definitely not things that citizens want.
Right.
And so Doge, in my view, Doge represents this sort of like chaotic shakeup that's
Mhm.
really been needed for a long time. And so I'm cheering it on. Really, my only criticism of Doge is that it's not going fast enough. It's not eliminating agencies and departments and bureaucracies outright. But
Right.
of course, we'll just have to see where it goes.
Yes. And those, just to belabor this bureaucracy point for just a little bit longer, here's a statement. I'll put it up on the screen for the viewers. It's from Torrent of Laws. So this quote says there are over 4,400 different federal forms for the that the private sector must fill out each year. That takes 143 million man hours. The federal Paperwork Commission recently estimated, and ladies and gentlemen, this is from 1975, 1979, somewhere in there when this was written. So it was recently estimated the total cost of federal paperwork imposed on private industry ranges from 25 billion to 32 billion dollars a year, and that a substantial portion of the cost is unnecessary. So there's just a brief insight into this mindset of what bureaucracy costs the economy.
Yeah, bureaucracy is a huge burden on our economy. Ludwig von Mises has a great book that's called Bureaucracy,
Yes.
and in that book he talks about the fundamental reason why bureaucracy has the outcomes that it does
Mm-hmm.
versus for-profit businesses in the private sector. And like I said before, the fundamental difference is the difference between in one case you have the profit and loss test, and in the other one you have to make these arbitrary sorts of decisions.
Mm-hmm.
You're not thinking about consumer demand for the service that you're providing. In fact, the incentives in bureaucracy is to just maintain and increase the size of the bureaucracy, whereas the incentives in the market are to continually provide for consumer demands. And if you're not doing that, if you're incurring losses, then there are automatic mechanisms that result in that business, that line of production, either decreasing in size, so fewer resources are going to that particular line, or being eliminated altogether. But I mean, we never hear about particular government bureaucracies being eliminated due to the fact that they're not providing something that consumers want, right? So, I mean,
Yeah.
that's just a fantasy. No, instead, usually what happens is if a bureaucracy is not delivering what voters want, the bureaucracy actually gets more funding, more resources
Yeah.
are sent to that bureaucracy. So it's a fundamental difference that results in waste. There's all sorts of avenues for fraud, corruption as
Mm-hmm.
well, and those sorts of things just uh, those sorts of things are severely punished in the market,
Yeah.
but they're allowed to live and thrive in the bureaucracy.
Yeah. And it I don't often quote Adolf Hitler, but he said, I use emotion for the many and reserve rational thought or reason for the few." And it certainly feels like one way that perpetuates the government industry, let's say, or subclass, is emotion. And so, how would you respond to people saying, "Oh, well, capitalists are not caring for the disadvantaged"?
So I would simply point them to what we know about economic calculation, what we know about entrepreneurship, and what we know about the profit and loss system. A lot of
Yeah.
people think that profit is this like ugly word. It's like this nasty thing. But really, what you should see or think about when
Mhm.
you consider profits is you should consider that as successfully uh, and efficiently using scarce resources to give consumers what they want, right? So that's what profits indicate. Profits indicate that this producer has given consumers what they want. And if we take like a really broad view of human history, and you look at different measures like life expectancy or
Mhm.
even something like GDP per capita, if you look at it on a global scale or even like region specific scales, we see this huge spike in living standards, we huge spike in human flourishing in general once we went away from the feudalist mindset where all production decisions were made by the person who was in charge of a specific plot of land, something like that. And we switched to this more entrepreneurial free market mindset where entrepreneurs were able to go out on their own and earn profits or potentially suffer losses. And
Mhm.
what we got was, it wasn't just this spike in flourishing, spike in living standards for the elite, because we already had relatively successful elites
Yes.
during feudal times. But what we saw was now the masses of consumers were now finally able to emerge from subsistence because they were able to consume a much larger quantity and much larger variety and higher quality goods
Mhm.
than before. And it's come to the point now where even like the poorest among us today they have higher living standards than some kings and queens of old. I mean, even
Yes.
just 100 years ago or 200 years
Hmm.
ago. And so we really need to take this a broader perspective when we're thinking about these sorts of questions, because it shows that we shouldn't take the market for granted. We shouldn't
Hmm.
take the profit and loss test of the market for granted, because what it has given us, and including this global division of labor, is living standards that would make the kings of old
Yes.
envious.
Envious, very envious. And I think one of the factors around that is the ability of acquiring food, and where before, let's say even what 200 years ago, less than that, even 100 years ago, that that struggle for sustainability and just with appetite, sustenance. Can you talk a little bit about those building blocks of society that we take for granted now, that have benefited from free market ideas?
Yeah, there's a great book, and I think there's some videos that go along with it by Matt Ridley that talk about food and food availability and food variety for the masses.
Yep.
And it was in reference to this conversation about the long time period overview. So the food that is available to us it's just it's mind-boggling when you consider the food that was available even to the elites of old,
Yeah.
right? So if you think about like a king a few hundred years ago, they might have had a personal chef, right? But even the food that chef would be able to prepare, it probably wouldn't have as many spices and flavorings. There wouldn't be as much variety. It would all be
Hmm.
based on the food that was locally available. But now, if you consider global supply chains and the global shipping of food everywhere, it
Hmm.
means that we all have this ability to consume food that uh, uh, people in older times wouldn't even be able to conceive of. They didn't even know about it.
Yeah. Right.
And if you think about the chef, the king's private chef, we have hundreds of chefs available to us. All you have to do is walk into a restaurant, shell out a few dollars, and you've got somebody who's willing to cook you food
Hmm.
that didn't even exist hundreds of years ago. So,
That's right.
in terms of availability of food, life expectancy, nutrition, we're off the charts rich compared to
Yeah.
even the kings of old.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, before we wrap things up, I got to ask, how can people get in touch with you?
Yeah, so I'm somewhat active on Twitter. So if you go to Twitter and you search my name, my username is at Newman J underscore R. You can find me there. But I also write regularly for the Mises website. So if you go to Mises.org, you'll see we have daily articles, and some of them are written by me. And so that would be a good way to see.
Yeah.
One extra thing that I'll add for your viewers
Yes.
here, the Mises Institute is running a promotion. We're trying to give away thousands of copies of Rothbard's "What Has Government Done to Our Money," which is
Wow.
a great overview of what money is, what banking is, and how government has monopolized it and really destroyed this
Hmm.
beautiful market institution.
Yeah.
And it's really an eye opener. It's sort of like it's many people's red pill when they start to consider
Yeah.
what government has done to money and all the evils of
Hmm.
central banking. So if you go to Mises.org/mymoney, you can get a free copy of that shipped to you.
Wow.
So the way you spell Mises is Mises, and so it's Mises.org/mymoney, and you can get a free
Good.
copy.
Good. And we'll put that on the screen too for those that are watching. Now, Ronald Reagan had said that politics begins at the dinner table. And the reason I'm bringing that up is you have two children's books. Can you talk about those?
Yeah, so I go to bookstores or to larger stores, and I see the books that are available to children,
Hmm.
and a lot of them are expressing this sort of like left wing ideology,
Yeah.
lots of wokeism as well. And so I was thinking we need our own children's books
Yeah.
because we have in Austrian economics, we have plenty of these, simple stories that teach great principles of sound economics and of the principles of liberty as well. Like you mentioned, Henry Hazlitt and Frederick Bastiat, they have this great story parable called the broken window parable.
Yes.
And so I turned that into a children's book. And then there's another one called Ludwig the Builder that goes through Mises's example of the architect, the builder who builds a house, and he uses that as a way to teach Austrian business cycle theory. I've got, I just mentioned Rothbard's What Has Government Done to Our Money? I've got one coming soon that is a children's book version of that. It's called The Magic Coin. So be on the lookout for that.
Oh, that'll be good. Yeah, my nephews, they're adults. Some of them are adults now. And when they were younger, I would talk to them about a squirrel. And if a squirrel gets an acorn, he can eat it, he could save it, or he could plant it and have a whole forest.
Oh, that's good. That's good.
And that's eventually I'm going to have some sort of book like that myself of some of these information where something as simple as a squirrel having a nut. He's got 3 options. Well, 4. I guess he could give it away. But that idea that we can eat our seed, we can save our seed, or we can plant our seed. There's to me, Austrian economics is the best one to advise that squirrel on what to do with his acorn.
That's a great idea. I'd strongly encourage that you follow through with that.
Yeah,
that'd be a great book.
Yeah, and well, not to give away too much, but I will, because we're chatting. Rocky the Counting Mouse. He's like your quintessential accountant friend that we all have, and obviously Sammy the Squirrel is friends with Rocky the Counting Mouse, right? But we'll work on that. It needs maybe some workshops to that. But I got to say, Jonathan, thank you so much for this conversation today.
Hey, thanks for having me. This has been wonderful.
Yeah, I'll have to have you on again because I got a list of questions we still have to talk about. And so, ladies and gentlemen, a sincere thanks to Jonathan for joining us today. And before we wrap up, I would like to remind our viewers of another spot that you can go on Mises.org. It's a generous organization because they want to get the truth out to people, and so they have free resources on their website to help you and your family learn more about finances and economics. And if you go to Mises.org/begin, there's some great information. There's some great explainer videos, things your adolescents, your teenagers could actually watch too. But start them young. Get Jonathan's books and watch for Sammy the Squirrel, I guess, and Rocky the Counting Mouse. That'll come out from 5 a.m. eventually. But, they're 2 really good friends, and they talk about nuts and things. So who doesn't want to read about that? But, once again, Jonathan, thanks so much for sharing your insights with us today.
Thanks.
Yeah, it was great. And thank you to our viewers. We appreciate you joining in the conversation. As I often say, as I'm concluding these shows, it's like we're sitting at a diner. You guys are behind us, or one of us. And as you do in a diner, you eavesdrop on the people in the booth behind you. It just happens. Call your friends over, share this conversation with them. I know that you're thinking of a couple of people who will really appreciate this conversation, and we will appreciate the shares. And one more thing, as I mentioned at the top of the show, if you could give us a 5-star review for 5 a.m. podcast on your favorite podcast player, we would appreciate that. And I need to mention a sincere thanks to those who have ventured over to buymeacoffee.com/5am podcast. We appreciate your participation in what we are doing and working towards here at 5 a.m. podcast. And as Jonathan and I talked about, profit is the measure that shows how beneficial we are to you, the listener. So thank you again for your support. Until next time, make sure to seize your day and enjoy those sunrises and sunsets. Thanks again for joining us. I'm Michael Clausen.